There were 5 graves behind Antonio Contadino's cottage, and he spent the day digging a new one. Antonio stood of average height, and he lived in Siena, Italy. He and his wife, Maria, and daughter, Isabella, lived in a quaint cottage. A pestilent boil had taken residence on the top of Maria's left foot a few days ago. It was then that the coughing and vomiting began. Before the boil formed, Maria had swatted her foot and killed the flea which bit her. She noted that the bubo had formed where the flea bit her. But now, early in the morning, Maria had coughed and retched no more. In her bed, she lay lifeless and cold. Antonio's hands quivered as he stood beside his cottage. He had plenty of farmland that he would need to tend to in the spring, but today he focused on one thing: burying his wife. A mound of dirt sat beside an open rectangular hole, and beside this hole were 5 other graves. Children of their past rest here, claimed by disease. Antonio kept their names etched into his mind, but did not speak about them much. Crops needed tending, and life moved on. The year is 1348, and death is expected. Each child who survives is a miracle from God. The bubonic plague had begun to waft through Sicily. It had already trespassed onto the doors of Siena and claimed his wife. Antonio didn't know, nor did anyone else know of the plague. All they knew was that the people who had purple boils were soon to die. Gray clouds rolled over tilled fields. There were lines of humped dirt, prepared for crops, and the grass was thin and yellow. From the east, wind hissed as it passed through skeletal trees. A dirt and cobblestone path crossed in front of Antonio's home. Travel upon it has increased since the whispers of death came to Siena. Antonio leaned against his cottage. His lower back throbbed, and his neck remained stiff. Sweat clung to his black bangs and glistened on his cheekbones. His eyes, brown and tired, scanned the tilled fields. The scent of dirt came unto him. Antonio withdrew his attention from the field and turned it toward the road, to the city. On the path before him walked a man slightly taller than himself. Antonio knew this man, and he smiled. The man in the distance was a friend made long ago, and his name was Matteo Furro. Matteo's brown and thick hair wafted against the wind, and he pulled his hood up to cover his ears. In his hand was a large sack. Flowers protruded from the top of it. Antonio smiled, because he had hoped Matteo would come and pay respects to Maria. Catching up with friends has become more difficult now. The famine had fingered its way through Europe. Everyone had to work more and socialize less. Behind Matteo clacked the hooves of a horse. Antonio could not see the stallion, but he could hear it. A pale white horse arose from the slight slope of a hill in the distance and passed Matteo. Atop the beast sat a small man, and on the back of the horse was a bag full of letters. The man was a courier, and today there was a message. Antonio stepped forward because the courier's eyes were fixed upon him. The horse neighed as the courier pulled it to a stop. Antonio fixed his hands on his hips and walked to the dirt road and cleared his throat. Antonio raised his hand into the air as though to catch something and said, "What news have you?" The courier turned around and ruffled through his bag of messages. He removed Antonio's and then drew a hard stare. He said, "Fair morning, sir of the fields." Dread and pestilence seemed to have spread from Kaffa to here. This much I know. The bodies of soldiers, long dead and ridden with purple buboes, have been used as fodder against the people of Kaffa. Innocent men, women, and even child. These people have seen the pestilent sores of those soldiers upon their own bodies, and they too soon perish. There is news that the streets of Sicily drip with the pus from those sores. What have we done to deserve such wrath as this? The courier grabbed the reins of the horse and kicked at its sides. He trotted down the road until he turned around a bend to never be seen again. Antonio opened the envelope, and inside was a letter from his sister, Francesca. It read, "Dearest brother, I have heard the most horrible of news, and I fear for the safety of ourselves and of your own family. I hereby request that you journey to our homestead, where we may live secluded from the dreadful nature of this pestilence. We have a vast root cellar and stores of food that can feed both our families. We have plenty of space on our farm, and because we live far enough away from the city of Farah, I do not fear that random interlopers will bring the terrible plague with them. Although these are the early years of the plague, I shriek at the horrors which transpire in my mind. Friends from afar had told me of what becomes of those who succumb to it, and I fear how quickly it has spread from the Asian countries to our homeland. Please, dear brother, heed my letter, for I fear this pestilence will not relent, and will strike with extreme prejudice. There are men made of madness who will use this pestilence and religion as their sword and shield. Please leave at once. With love, Francesca." Antonio shivered as he pulled his eyes away from the letter and looked at Matteo, who now stood a few feet away. He nodded at his beloved friend, and no sooner Matteo embraced Antonio. Matteo squeezed his dear friend tight in his arms. The strength of men was punctuated by tenderness and compassion. Matteo patted his friend's shoulder and rubbed his head against the nape of his neck. There Antonio wept, and for a while they stood together, not as friends, but as brothers in mourning. To lose Maria was to lose a wife, a mother, and for Matteo, a beloved friend of his family. Matteo leaned back and kept his hand at the nape of Antonio's neck. He said, "If my mother born unto me a brother, he would surely be you." Antonio smiled and said, "You and I, we feel the same. Now come." His smile sank as he returned to his cottage. The room which they entered was cozy, and against its north wall was a small fireplace. There were 2 beds, one on each side of the cottage, and a table at its center. In the bed on the left side of the cottage lay Maria. Her arms were folded against her ribs, and her hands rested atop her heart. Maria's eyes remained closed, and she appeared to be sleeping, but everyone there knew she was dead. Matteo glanced at the other bed and noticed Isabella sitting atop it. She was 11 and had the same black hair as her father and pale skin as her mother. Her eyes were brown, and they appeared sunken into their sockets. She's had to bear witness to the death of 2 of her siblings and now the death of her mother. Sleep became something elusive to her, and famine had already made their lives difficult. Isabella could remember greener times when the fields were full of crops. Rain came more frequently. Though she couldn't explain it, she believed that these were the darkest times in a dark era. The pestilent sore on her mother signified that something worse was to come. Isabella flinched as she looked at her right forearm. There was a purple splotch resembling something like a bruise. She drew her attention away from it and looked over the table and studied her mother's chest. She waited for it to rise, but it would not. Maria's eyes did not peel open, nor did they flinch when a fly landed upon them. Antonio shooed away the fly and stood over Maria's head. He grabbed the bedsheet she lay upon, and Matteo grabbed the end by her feet. Together they lifted Maria from her bed, and Isabella hurried for the door. She opened it, and then they came outside. The 3 of them stood beside the grave. The men shuffled Maria over the gaping hole in the earth and then proceeded to lower her into it. Antonio's arms shook as he gazed upon his wife's face. A tear streaked from his eye and dripped off his nose. It splashed against Maria's chin. He exhaled a deep breath as she reached the bottom. Antonio released the white sheet and it fell into the grave. It draped across Maria's right shoulder. He stood straight up and then looked at his dear friend and then his daughter. Isabella's focus remained on her mother, and Matteo's was on Antonio. Matteo crossed his arms and looked at Isabella, whose mouth had now slightly fallen open. Tears dripped from her chin, and her eyes were red. Her brows furrowed upward as she placed her trembling hands over her mouth. She whispered into the dead wind, "Madre, dearest Madre." Antonio approached his daughter and pressed her head against his shoulder. There she cried and clawed at his chest. It did not ease the pain. As father and daughter, they stood as one. Isabella pressed her eyes shut and bore herself into her father's loving embrace. Nothing could bring her mother back, and she knew it. She feared that this same fate would take someone else from her. Her father. She wept more. He held her as tightly as any father could. In his comfort, she found the strength to dry her tears and say her final goodbyes. "Madre, I will miss you more than the night misses the sun, more than a desert mouse misses cool water. I promise to live by the hand of your words and honor you with respectable actions. I have been blessed with the good fortune of your love, and now and forever after, I shall love you with all that I am." She fell to her knees and wiped a few more tears away. Antonio peered into the grave and said, "Beloved, there is no God that could have crafted a more splendid woman than he did you, and I am blessed to have you accept my invitation into marriage. We have born into this dark world children, and now you are among them. I ask, as you play with them in heaven, you speak of their Father, and tell them that I am eager to meet them. I do not wish for death, but I do wish to hold them once again. Though your passing is tragic, you will finally get to hold the children we have lost. I love you, my dearest. Forever will I think of you before sleep takes me. Rest now and forever after in peace." Matteo stood silent and nodded his head. As somber and tragic as it was, this moment of the deceased belonged to her and her family. Though he was a great friend, he knew that Maria's final hour belonged to Isabella and Antonio. He remained silent and waited for Antonio to decide what to do next. As they stood against the cool spring gales, a subtle rocking broke the silence. Down the path rode a carriage, and its driver was a man who wore a waxy black leather cloak and hood. His face resembled a skeletal bird, and two flat goggles protruded from his mask where his eyes would be. Antonio studied the figure and tried to see the man's eyes, but he couldn't. The glass of the goggles was black, and the hood obscured them. The man wore waxy black leather gloves and boots, and at his side was a single stick painted black. It shone against the pale sunlight. On each side of the plague doctor sat a single guard with sword and shield. The shields were white with a red cross painted across them. The guards were clad in iron chainmail, helmets, and greaves. Behind the plague doctor was an archer who already had his bow drawn on them. Antonio did not know why, but knew that if they were to run, it would be futile. Behind the marksman was a carriage large enough for a few people. It rocked and creaked as it rode over the cobblestones and sunk into small pits in the road. The plague doctor arrived before Antonio's cottage. He wrested the steed's reins and climbed out of his seat. As he descended a slight ladder, his outfit squeaked, and when he spoke, it sounded guttural and faded. The plague doctor said, "Greetings, Contadino family and friend. I am Pietro Rattadore, Siena's primary physician." Pietro walked toward the open grave, and his boots gave a wretched, squeaking noise with each step. He looked in and said, "I have been informed that one of you, well, her, bore the purple blemishes of God's wrath. I suggested to the church that those who have been near such individuals be quarantined. The lazarettos just across the way have been prepared." He pointed at the edge of the city's walls. At its side were a dozen stone huts, which had been erected hastily. He drove his cane back into the earth and leaned upon it. He continued, "I will perform a physical inspection. If there is anything to arouse suspicion, I will place you where you can be cared for. Your quarantine will also keep others safe." Isabella's throat tightened and her hands fidgeted. She thought about the bruise on her forearm. The plague doctor limped to Matteo and examined his pits, neck, arms, and legs. Matteo was clean. He then searched Antonio, and the result was much the same. The doctor stepped before Isabella and tilted her head with his cane. He swooped in close to her, and his beak nearly rubbed against her chest. He stared and studied her, and his head swooped from side to side. His leather outfit curled and whined as he examined her pits and her arms. He turned her forearm within his hand and drew his cane across the purple bruise. Isabella said, "I heard it digging the grave. That's a bruise, not a bubo." The doctor's head tilted as he examined it with his other eye and said, "Well, we cannot be too sure about that." His fingers wrapped around Isabella's wrist, and she pulled as his grip tightened. The two guards leaped from the carriage. They drew their swords and stood between Isabella, Antonio, and Matteo. As the plague doctor pulled her, she stumbled against the cobblestones of the road, and her hair swayed in the wind. She reached for Antonio, and her hand shook as they dangled in the void. Isabella screamed then, and reached as far as she could. The plague doctor's grip proved relentless. Antonio stood still as his heart raced and sweat dripped from his chin. His hand shook as his sword remained drawn to his neck. Isabella fought against the plague doctor as he pulled her behind the carriage and then placed her into it. The doors were shut, and the padlock engaged. The plague doctor climbed atop his carriage and called for his guards to return. They did so, and released Antonio and Matteo. As the plague doctor turned the carriage around, Isabella reached out of the window. Between thick and heavy iron bars, Isabella groped in vain. She screamed for her father, but he could do nothing. As the carriage rolled across the hill, Antonio stood against the wind. The early spring gales pushed against him. Antonio searched in vain for the right words to say, but only found dread and terror, causing him to quiver. Matteo sensed his friend's fear and placed his hand on his shoulder. Together they walked somberly into Antonio's cottage. The heat of the fireplace enveloped the dwelling. Atop the table in the center of the room sat a plate of leftover pasta and bread. Matteo lifted the plate and brought it to Antonio, and then seated himself at Isabella's bed before placing it in his lap. Antonio closed his eyes as he bit off a piece of bread and chewed. The taste was bitter and stale. He gazed into the flames of the fireplace and realized that to stay in Siena was certain death. Matteo sensed what Antonio was thinking and dumped his sack of flowers onto the table. He filled the sack with grains, preserved meat, and rummaged about for more food. The famine had struck them and left Antonio and his family little to spare. Matteo placed the sack of food into Antonio's lap and then stood beside the door. It creaked as he leaned against it. Matteo said, "I plan on leaving soon. You should do the same." He then left through the door. Bitter winds breathed into the cottage as the door shut behind Matteo. Antonio remembered an old tree stump about an hour's walk away, beside a small lake. He decided it would be there he would store his sack of food. And now, reaching for the door with sack in hand, he returned to the outside world. The plan was simple: rescue his daughter and then walk to Ferrara. A trip that would take 2 days seemed like a long time, but with food and blankets, Antonio knew they would be okay. Antonio investigated both directions of the cobblestone path and found that it was empty. He grinned and began to walk away from Siena. After about 2 miles or 30 minutes, a small lake appeared in the distance. Antonio turned right into the forest. The trees stood tall and remained skeletal. Buds had sprouted upon their branches, and they were ready for spring. Antonio examined the trees in search of a particular tree that had a triangular hole at its base. He found it, and from there he turned left and walked forward. A hollow tree stump appeared in the distance, and Antonio scurried towards it. He glanced over his shoulders and saw no one. His fingers ached and his hands felt tight as he reached into the stump. At the bottom of the mossy stump sat a cold stone. He lifted it, and beneath it was a vast hole filled with leaves. Antonio heaved as he wobbled the stone out of the stump and then set it down beside him. He scooped out the leaves, placed his sack in the hole, and then buried it with those same leaves. Once it was over with, he rested beside the tree stump and left the stone beside it. To set the stone in the stump would crush the food he placed there. Antonio took a few deep breaths in and noticed that the sounds of spring began to surface. Birds sang and soft winds blew through skeletal branches. Budding leaves peppered the branches of oak and beech trees. Sweat glistened atop his forehead, and though the world around him was cool, he felt warm. Yellow swaths of grass were shrinking, and green spread across the forest floor. The aroma of pine was carried by the traveling winds, and the day was nice. He stood up and stretched his arms before exiting the forest. As he walked into a small clearing before a lake, he noticed a figure far off in the distance, across the lake. The plague doctor stood, and the sunlight reflected off his goggles. His waxy cloak glistened beneath the pale sunlight, and then his focus turned toward Antonio. He shook as the doctor tilted his head and examined him. Antonio turned his head down and walked away from the lake. His feet were heavy and his legs had become sore. A coughing fit overtook him as he walked, and he did his best to conceal it. The plague doctor leaned against his cane and watched Antonio walk down the cobblestoned road. Antonio's legs ached as he walked to his cottage. As his home came into view, he noticed the hole in the ground where his wife lay. He had not forgotten, but knew that she would prefer he plan an escape. Once he arrived home, he lifted the shovel from the ground and began to scoop up dirt and pitch it into Maria's grave. His arms hurt more than they should have, and his neck felt stiff. He exhaled a few deep breaths and rubbed his lower back. It hurt, but that much he could explain. Digging a grave was not easy. Antonio glanced down the long road beside his home and saw a figure emerge in the distance. He grimaced, for he knew who it was and where he was likely to go. He continued to shovel dirt into his wife's grave as the plague doctor limped closer. After a good amount of time, the plague doctor stood no more than 15 feet away. Antonio shoveled the dirt and paid no attention to Pietro, the plague doctor. Pietro leaned against his cane and examined Maria's grave. Antonio exhaled and said, "What do you want?" Pietro stepped a few feet closer and said, "I've come bearing news and a warning. Your daughter, Isabella, will receive treatment tonight. I will be the one to administer the bloodletting." Pietro leaned on his cane and then continued, "I would also like to warn you that the church forbids travel. If you are sick, you must remain where you are, lest you spread it to where you go." Antonio snorted and looked at the mound of dirt that covered his wife. He bit his bottom lip as his eyes shifted. He teetered to his left side and turned toward the plague doctor. He said, "I feel I am burdened with this truth. I believe the coming plague is carried by fleas. Those same fleas make homes of rodents and animals." The plague doctor's head tilted, and he turned on his cane. His leather outfit whined as he did so. Antonio continued, "A flea bit Maria, and in that same location, a purple bubo appeared. I do not believe this plague is a punishment from God." Pietro, the plague doctor, replied, "Are you so bold that you would dare question the voice of God? Has the Pope not declared that this pestilence is a punishment for men and their sins?" Pietro turned away from Antonio and began to limp down the street toward the city. Pietro walked 5 or so paces ahead and then turned around. His outfit cried as he did so. Pietro continued, "This city is a palace of God, and to abandon it is to abandon God. Be warned, there will be consequences if you decide to abandon your God." Antonio squeezed his hands and his throat tightened. He wanted to strangle Pietro, but he knew doing so would lead only to execution. Instead, he said, "I believe you are wrong." Pietro turned around, pointed his cane at Antonio and hissed, "Do not doubt the power of God in his intents, heretic." Pietro coughed into his mask as he turned around and walked toward the city. Gales ceased, and silence befell them. The whining of Pietro's boots was all Antonio could hear as he walked down the path. Antonio picked up the shovel and returned to burying his wife. Hours passed by and the sun fell in the distance. The time it took to bury her seemed too long, and now there was one thing left to do. Antonio grabbed his makeshift cross and impaled the ground above Maria's head. The wooden cross, made of planks, slanted in the earth. Moss had already started to grow upon the wood of the cross. Antonio stretched his back and exhaled. He returned to the warmth of his cottage, and a rush of warm air crossed his cheeks. Matteo sat on the bed that Maria had died on. He held a cup of hot water, and his hand shook as he lifted it to his lips. His focus is on the fire licking the air and his own family holed up in his cottage. He lifted his stare from the fireplace and looked into Antonio's eyes. Silence was shared between them as Antonio sat upon Isabella's bed. The fire cracked and popped, and then thunder rolled across the sky. Clouds, heavy and gray, hung over Siena, and the scent of rain was brought by a subtle breeze. Antonio didn't mind the coming rain, and instead ate more leftover food. He said, with food in his cheek, "I am going to get Isabella out. We can't stay here." Matteo nodded and said, "We've already started packing. We cannot stay either. There are corpses resting upon carts in the city. There are few, but I fear that soon there will be many." Antonio's eyebrows sunk as wonder grabbed him. He said, "Who has died now?" Matteo frowned and his eyes sank. He said, "Richard and William and Agnes. Wonderful people, now lying in a wooden cart. Deep graves have become shallow with corpses. For each grave dug, there are 2 who die every day. I do not understand why they do not flee." Antonio nodded and said, "It appears people are already fleeing. The plague doctor, if one could call him that, spoke of a travel restriction. We cannot leave the city, and I assume no one can come into it. I believe that is what Pietro implied. Matteo shook his head in dismay and said, I will leave at once. And so, to you, dear friend, I bid you farewell. I hope you will leave as well. We had thought about sneaking into the night, but guards closed the gates of the city at sundown. Antonio mulled his friend's words in his head as he chewed on the stale bread. Antonio wanted to believe that there was some kind of master plan, but over the past few years, his faith had waxed and waned. What was left of his faith was indescribable. He couldn't rationalize how a loving God would allow the events which have occurred to occur. Antonio nodded in agreement and contemplated many things. He wondered about the church and why they responded the way they did. Had others noticed what Maria had, and was there anything he could do about it? He finished his bread, washed it down with a cup of water which had sat on the table, and turned in Isabella's bed. There was a window behind him, and it was latched shut. He opened it, and from where he sat, he could see Isabella's lazaretto. Her screams scraped against the walls of his skull, and then he swallowed the bread in his mouth. Though he had a vast wealth of love for Matteo and his family, he knew that he had to save himself and his only child. Without her, there'd be nothing to live for. He arose from the bed and placed a dim candle in the window. Antonio knew Isabella wouldn't be able to see it, but he hoped she could. Matteo shuffled around on the bed and then rose to his feet. He hugged his friend and said, Antonio, I wish you all the well and I hope you find safety. With that, Matteo left the cottage and Antonio to his lonesome. The night became morning, and at the window Antonio still sat. Through the night, the cold air felt pleasant upon his burning skin. Sweat coated his forehead, and he felt something tender on the left side of his groin. He ignored it because he did not want to know the truth. Antonio coughed into his hand and then approached the door. The plan for today was simple. Go to the priest and request the release of his daughter. Since he had a place to go, he thought there might be some slight chance that he could free his daughter. Antonio stood up and felt the world wobble to the left side of his face. He stooped to the table and leaned against it. Once he regained his balance, he approached his back door and looked outside. Clouds up above cast shadows upon a slight hill before the city, and the green patches of grass continued to spread. The air was still, and the scent of dew hung high. Though the March weather was still very cool, Antonio felt too hot in his home and outside. His face had become pale, and he noticed his head wobbled slightly as he stood. Matteo sat atop a small carriage, and beside him was his wife and 2 children. There were sacks of food, clothing, and other items stuffed into the carriage. Behind Matteo approached 5 guardsmen with swords drawn. They cornered Matteo off before he could go any further, and the guardsmen took their reins of the horses. One by one, Matteo and his family were taken from the carriage, and each of them were bound by shackles and tethers. Antonio drew a hard squint as he watched his friend squirm against the hold of 3 guards. Altogether, Matteo's family was escorted back to Siena as prisoners and housed in the dungeons. Antonio felt a sense of unease at the thought of his own escape. The image of his daughter getting dragged away flashed in his mind, and he shuddered. He began to walk toward Siena, so that way he could beg for the release of his daughter. Antonio left his cottage then, and stepped into the cold spring air. He had mustered the courage to request his daughter's release. Should the church refuse his appeal, he mulled in his head what he could offer to the guard of the lazarettos. Antonio found that the only thing in his inventory was his home. Maybe an appeal to the guard's faith was a better option. He knew that if a guard were to be caught releasing someone, both he and the guard would face certain execution. A small farm cottage may not be worth it for the guard, but the eternal damnation of his soul may pierce the veil of his guardship. The means in which he planned to manipulate the guard were vague at best, but he had begun to plan something which may work. As he walked along the cobblestone road towards Siena, he remembered Bible verses that may be of use. He thought of ways to appeal to the tenderness and loving nature of God, and the wrath one may suffer if those qualities are denied to one's daughter. He suspected these notions may open a window to doubt in the guard's mind. There, Antonio may take advantage of the guard's fragile state. He would have to dig into the uncertainty of the time upon them, and exploit the fractured faith which binds servicemen to their lords and churches. A sudden drizzle fell over the land as Antonio pressed on. Droplets of rain pattered against his shoulders, and the air seemed colder now. Antonio did not mind, because he has been feeling too hot lately. He knew that he ran a fever, and the sore in his groin ached more than it did yesterday. Those things were ignored as he closed the distance between himself and Siena. As he approached the city's walls, he looked over the lazarettos and into the one which housed his daughter. He approached it and looked down. His daughter sat on the floor, and the bruise that was once on her forearm had disappeared. Joy overtook him, as did sorrow. Her lazaretto was made of stone cemented together, and their top was made of wood. The floor was dirt, but because of the rain, it had become muddy. Isabella's feet were caked with mud, as were her hands. She brushed her hair behind her ears and looked up. She smiled and jumped forward against the window of the lazaretto. Antonio said, "I have a plan. If the church ignores my appeal, I will remove you by word or force. I will come with a blade in hand, and I shall refrain from using it until I must. Tonight, we will retreat into the forest, and flee to where I hid supplies in the trunk of a tree. From there, we will walk for 2 days to Ferrara." Antonio noticed the guard walking his way. Far in the distance, the guard shouted, "Not so close, have you no sense?" Isabella sighed but felt relief now knowing her father had some sort of plan. She did not know how long she would be in the lazaretto because the guards never told her. Antonio did not know either. He kissed the palm of his hand and placed it against the cold stone wall of Isabella's makeshift prison. She did much the same. Antonio withdrew from the lazarettos and entered the city of Siena. As he passed between mossy stone walls and under the heavy iron gates of the city, he shuddered as the stench of decaying flesh wafted against his nose. The sounds of carts rolling atop cobblestone penetrated his ears, as did the subtle chatter of townsfolk in the center of town. There were buildings that stood 3 stories in height. They were eclipsed by smaller buildings. Their windows were thin, narrow, tall, and the color of pale yellow. Dirt had taken root in the corner of these windows. Bits of the sun reflected off the few clean speckles of the windows. Antonio glanced around and saw the horror which Matteo spoke of. About 40 feet ahead of him sat a cart of cadavers, all laid in the same fashion. Their bodies lie beside each other, and their feet dangle over the cart's edge. A tan linen sheet covered the cadavers, but it was not large enough to cover the feet of these people. Their toes were black, and their nails had begun to lift from the flesh. Antonio's throat felt tight, and he blinked a few times. Their feet glistened against the pale rays of the sun, and the drizzle had now become rain. The linen sheet which draped over them was stained red and pus yellow. Beneath the cart were small patches of red, a result of the corpses at the bottom spilling their contents. Antonio removed his attention from the macabre scene before him and searched for the cathedral of Santa Maria Assunta, the heart and jewel of Siena. The cathedral stood as a testament to Italian craftsmanship. Antonio marveled before its splendor. Spires reached high, and the structure itself stretched onward. A single stained glass window sat above a vast wooden door. There were 2 other doors beside the main door, and they were embossed by intricate archways. The Gothic nature of the cathedral still left Antonio gasping before its beauty. Antonio approached the middle doorway and proceeded into the cathedral. Vaulted ceilings reach higher than man or myth could ever hope to reach. If a burning bush were present, it would burn with excitement at the cathedral's splendor. Antonio stood for a moment and observed the ornate details of the cathedral. There were paintings and stained glass windows which colored the light. The soft sound of a chorus sung to his left, and before him stood the Siena priest. In front of him were pews, and there were people sitting in them. Many people had their heads slumped in prayer. Others listened to the beautiful melodies of the chorus. Antonio approached the priest, who was speaking to his deacons. The priest wore a black hooded robe and a white robe cinch at his waist. He was a thin man, and he stood tall. Antonio approached them. As he drew closer, the priest of Siena turned his attention to Antonio. The priest's blue eyes were large, and parts of the whites therein were yellow. He removed his hood and exposed his bald head. His cheeks were gaunt, and his face was too. He, too, felt the punishment of famine. The priest said, "God bless you, sir. I am Giovanni Priori. How may I aid you?" Antonio felt the world around him swirl, but he remained upright. Fortunately for him, he was soaked because of the rain. The priest assumed the sweat upon Antonio's body was rain, and he was partly correct. Antonio said, "Pietro took my daughter and placed her into a lazaretto. The purple mark upon her forearm was no more than a bruise she suffered during the excavation of her mother's grave. I ask for yours and God's permission to allow me to remove my daughter from her confines, so that way we may travel north to Ferrara. I have family awaiting our arrival, and it is urgent we leave at once." Giovanni turned toward the deacon on his left and whispered into his ear. The deacon left swiftly, and then Giovanni returned his attention to Antonio. Giovanni said, "Ah, I believe I saw you tilling the fields last season. I also believe you are the same pitiless fool who spoke heresy to Pietro. He had come to me at the late hour of the day and confided that a farmer had said fleas were to blame for this pestilence. Insignificant insects that do not warrant a second glance upon death were to be accountable for the buboes upon people's bodies?" Giovanni turned away from Antonio and began to walk away. Antonio said, "The bubo upon my wife's body appeared at the same location the flea bit her. That is no coincidence. I only ask that you release my daughter so that we may leave at once. We will rid the city of ourselves and depart." Giovanni turned around and slunk his head low. He rushed to Antonio and then proceeded to wrap his fingers around Antonio's jaw. Giovanni said, "You are in Italy. You are one man in this country, and it doesn't matter where you go. You will spill this plague upon all who await you. Heed my warning. If you leave this city, I will give Pietro supreme authority over your life. Rather than try to escape, repent for your heresy, and may God forgive you for such a sin." Giovanni released Antonio's jaw and backed away. He continued, "God will spare those who walk his righteous path. You should consider walking it." He turned from Antonio and said as he walked away, "Also, your skin is warm to the touch." Antonio bit his bottom lip and his fingertips tingled. He could not recall a time when a priest grabbed him like that, and he wondered what they know that he does not. He left the cathedral, and the smell and sight of death invaded his senses once again. At the base of the cathedral stood a man, and before him was a crowd. Antonio could not remember walking past this man earlier. Therefore, he assumed he had just now arrived. Antonio was correct in his assumption. The man was balding and wore a brown robe cinched by a black frayed belt. He held his hands high and his cheeks shook as he spoke. He said, "Citizens of Siena, cast your faith to the church and do not abandon her. Matteo Furro, master of the forge and father of few, had tried to abandon us. The crowd booed. The man continued. He and his family have been dragged to the dungeons where they await their sentencing. What fate should await them? Should it be a hanging? Banishment? Should they be reduced to serfdom? Antonio's ears perked as he listened to the man talk of Matteo's fate. The man continued as the crowd cheered each punishment. Should we break his bones and force him to walk, or tie him to 2 horses and make those steeds run? These people are cowards who bent before God. That is why the breath of this bubonic God breathes upon the napes of our necks and leave behind this pestilent sores. Repent before your day is nigh and bring yourselves to the church. Here you will find salvation. Here you will be spared from the buboes of the bubonic God. And here, locked in Siena, you will be free. Embrace these holy words and do not fret. Antonio couldn't bear to listen any longer. He removed himself from the display and made his leave. Whispers of tainted gales began to circulate through the city. As he passed through the gates of Siena, he glanced at the cathedral one last time. He had no intention of returning. Antonio focused on the lazaretto which sat at his left, and he caught a glint of his daughter's eyes. They were full of sorrow and desperation. He thought of the many rats and their fleas in the city, and how many more were on their way with the warm spring weather. The thought of his wife smacking the flea where it bit her, and what came next crossed his mind. Summer did not feel like a wonderful time full of bounty. It resembled something like a blanket made of the corpses he saw in that cart. This blanket would smother Siena. None would be able to escape, not even those who believed God was on their side. These beautiful buildings would rot. The cathedral would be marred and stained by the blood of those who sought refuge but couldn't. Antonio thought of the madness of men, how there are more people like that man who shouted in front of the cathedral, how they would use a tragedy such as this to impose their own will, how they would use the deaths of children as a reason for their martyrdom. He did not fear the pestilent sores or his death, but how people would treat his daughter in his absence. Antonio walked down the long cobblestone path to his cottage. Once he arrived, he entered his home and sat in front of the fire. Antonio waited for the sun to fall behind the clouds and for the night to strengthen its grip upon Siena. He ate the last of his bread and pasta and emptied his cup. This cottage, where he met all of his children and watched all but one perish, felt distant now. The cottage had become no more than stone and wood. Though the fire crackled, he wondered if this coldness he felt was because of his wife's passing. Maria's presence brought a certain kind of warmth and joy, and now it was gone. He looked outside and noticed the full moon hung high now. The air was cool, and the clouds were sparse. Dew glistened off the tips of grass, and trees gently swayed against soft gales. Antonio walked the path toward the lazaretto and approached the guard. Antonio said, "Fine, sir, I ask for your attention." The guard, who had been half asleep at this point, stood up from the ground in which he sat. He drew his sword, and Antonio raised his hands. He realized then he had forgotten to bring a blade. The guard said, "I've been warned of you. Be off, or I will smite you." Antonio stepped back and said, "My name is Antonio Contadino, and I ask that you consider Psalm 34:18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." The guard flinched and did not know what to say. Antonio continued, "You are a brave man crushed by the weight of this pestilence, and deserving of the bounty heaven will offer you. But I ask, have you shown my daughter mercy?" The guard shrugged. He said, "Pietro had placed her here. I will not question his authority." Antonio stepped closer to the guard and said, "There is no authority greater than Jesus and his Father, the Lord Almighty." The guard's eyes shifted, and Antonio continued. Matthew 5:7. Blessed are the merciful, they will be shown mercy. Matthew 6:14. For if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins. Antonio placed his hand on the blade and said, Pietro is beholden to the same God you are, and you have not been merciful to my daughter. Gaze upon her arm and ask, do you see a bubo? The guard turned around and glanced at Isabella's arm. Her skin was free of blemishes. Antonio said, Proverbs 17:15, acquitting the guilty and condemning the innocent. The Lord detests them both. Have you not followed Pietro's orders as though he were a god? And do you not stare unto my daughter's arm and see that she is innocent of his accusations? Antonio stepped closer to the guard. Have you not considered that you have sinned by keeping her here? And do you not fear the depths of hell? Antonio noticed the sword falter, and the guard took a few steps back. He did not consider that he may be sinning in this moment, and feared the eternal torture that he felt was sure to come now. Antonio took note of this. He drove the final verbal dagger into the guard's resolve when he said, God's bubonic breath spreads buboes upon anyone who feels it, and you have felt it. If death took you today, would the sin you are committing keep you at the gates of heaven, or would your skin blister from the heat of hell? Free my daughter, and we both shall forgive you. The guard's sword dropped in place, and he fumbled for the keys to the lazaretto. He unlocked the padlock, and Antonio removed Isabella from the horrible cramped space. Antonio and Isabella reassured the guard of their forgiveness. Together, they fled into the night. The sound of Antonio and Isabella's feet pattering against the cobblestone road echoed in the cold night. Together they ran down the road and passed their old home. Isabella had to slow her stride because her father could not keep up. He coughed into his elbow every so often, and the sore in his groin hurt more now. Antonio said nothing of his condition and ran faster than Isabella to mask his pain. They passed their cottage, and Antonio led them to the edge of the small lake. Steam in the moonlight's reflection clung to the water's surface. Antonio searched for the tree which marked the spot and then proceeded toward the tree stump. Isabella followed as her father marched forward. It was then that gray clouds blotted out the moonlight. Silver rays fell upon the ground, but the area in which they could see became much darker. Antonio found the tree stump and noticed that leaves had been scattered about by its base. He looked into the stump and saw that his store of supplies had disappeared. His eyes pressed shut as he thought of Pietro, watching him emerge from the forest a few days prior. Antonio said, "It appears we've been bested, and Pietro took our supplies." Isabella approached the tree stump and looked in. She said, "Madre taught me how to forage, and you taught me how to hunt. We will be fine." Antonio smiled and felt a sense of comfort from his daughter's words. Antonio looked up and brushed his fingertips against his daughter's cheeks as he said, "I've missed you. And yes, to survive is to know how to hunt and forage. You are correct. Our journey will be tough, though, but not impossible." Droplets of rain began to patter at his shoulder and hair as thunder crackled. Antonio stood up as the rain increased in volume, and he heard something then. The thunder of hooves against the forest floor fell upon him. He turned his head toward the sound and saw Pietro turning from the road and away from the lake. As the steed turned towards them, Pietro's eyes were veiled by his hood. All that could be seen was Pietro's bird-like beak. In his hand was a lantern that revealed the secrets of the forest with an orange glow. Pietro's cloak seemed to breathe with each stride of the stallion. The horse was clad in iron mail, and atop that mail was a white cloth. The steed was black and strong, and it did not neigh or relent as its driver commanded it to run faster. Pietro removed his cane from his hip and pointed it at Antonio. He said, "You have forsaken your city and the God which lives there. You have been warned about the spread of disease. You have facilitated the escape of an infected individual. You betrayed the people of Siena and Italy. Most importantly, you have betrayed the church and God. I beg that you reconsider and turn back now, or I will exercise my full authority upon both of you. I am your judge. Remember that." Antonio sidestepped toward the tree stump and peeled a piece of bark from it. He threw it at the horse's right eye, and it connected. The steed neighed and retreated into the forest, and with it Pietro. He grabbed his daughter's hand and ran toward Ferrara. As they ran, the sound of hooves departed them, only to return. Pietro withdrew a saber from his waist, and it gleamed against the moonlight. He raised the blade and swung at a tree he thought was Antonio. The goggles he wore had become foggy, and he could not see much, but the blade cut through the bark and sliced into the tree. Pietro raised his hood and looked around in the forest. Where Antonio and Isabella ran to, he did not know. He kicked the horse's ribs and commanded it to turn. Still, he saw nothing. From the shadows, a rock the size of a fist sailed through the air and hit Pietro in the skull. He fell from his horse and felt his legs snap. There he lay on the ground now, broken and writhing. Antonio, who had found refuge inside of a vast bush, had found stones that could be of use. As he watched Pietro move on the ground, he studied his breathing. He knew that Pietro was likely unconscious, but also knew that he had a saber. The chance of Pietro rising and pursuing them was too great. Antonio sat silently with his daughter, and they watched Pietro's back rise and fall as he breathed. They inched deeper into the forest, away from Pietro. Isabella whispered, "We should break the lantern." Antonio agreed, and he grabbed a stone. He threw it at the lantern and missed. Isabella threw a stone and she missed. This aroused Pietro, and he pushed himself from the forest floor. He rubbed his head, and then Antonio threw another stone. This one hit the lantern and broke it. The rain extinguished the fire inside it, and now all that remained was the cold and wet darkness of the forest. Pietro looked in the direction of the assailing stones and saw Antonio in the bush. Antonio gestured to his daughter to flee. She arose from the wet dirt and ran deep into the forest. Pietro noticed her and readied his blade. As she ran and Pietro arose to his feet, Antonio charged for the plague doctor and ran into his shoulder. Pietro fell to his back, and his bird-like mask slid off. Antonio stood over him. He snarled as he examined Pietro's face. His face was thin, and his hair was long and white. Yellow teeth revealed themselves as he gasped for air, and below his jaw sat a purple, pestilent bubo. Pietro fidgeted as he groped for the saber. Antonio said, "You're dying from this black death?" Pietro's eyes swiveled upon him, and they were glassy and yellow. His irises were pale blue. Pietro said, "This disease took my family in Sicily. I was only trying to help. In God's name, I did not want anyone to suffer as I did. Now all will suffer. Forgive me, Heavenly Father." Pietro tried to sit up, but he could not. He coughed into his hands, and blood splashed off his lips. Antonio winced as he noticed Pietro's right leg had been shattered where he fell. He slid open Pietro's cloak and saw the bone had torn through the skin and cloth of his pants. Next to the bone rested another bubo beside Pietro's knee. Antonio said, "This is why you've limped." Pietro laid upon his back and looked at the clouds rolling overhead. He said, "My wife could not breathe just before the pestilence took her. I cannot breathe now. Flee if you must, but allow me to die in quiet peace beneath the stars." He coughed once more, and his breath seemed flooded. Antonio called for Isabella to return, and she did. Once she emerged from the forest, he directed her toward the steed and guided her onto its back. He climbed on behind her, and together they sat atop the black steed and rode into the depths of the forest. As the day broke, Antonio found it harder to hold on to the reins of his newfound horse. He wobbled to and fro until all at once he fell from the steed. He clutched his chest and heaved for breath. Isabella stopped the horse and stooped low, for she wasn't sure about her father's condition. Antonio coughed and splatters of blood sprayed from his mouth. Isabella climbed down from the horse and scurried to her father. Her heart thumped hard and her hands tingled because she knew what the blood meant. She struggled to take a deep breath in, and her world seemed to have shrunk. Antonio gestured for her to carry on, but she refused to acknowledge his suggestion. She slid her arms under her father's armpits and tried to scoop him up. Antonio was not a large man, but he was too large for his daughter, who was 11. Isabella cried as Antonio shoved her away from him. He rolled to his side and said, "Go. If I turn well, I will find you. You know the way to Auntie's. Take the steed. You are less than half a day out from their farm. Go, leave at once." Isabella stepped away from her father and grabbed the horse's reins. She said, "It's what took Mother, isn't it?" Antonio coughed into his hand and then said, "Either I journey with you or join Maria at the gates of heaven. Either way, I am blessed. As for you, I beg that you leave me, lest you also succumb to this black death." He rolled over and stretched his arms. The grass felt cool to his touch now, and the world seemed to fade. Isabella climbed atop the steed and said, "I love you, Padre. I hope we meet again." Antonio replied, "Either at Ferrara or the gates of heaven. Be still and ride true, sweet daughter. Remember, my love for you is a sun that will never set." Isabella cried as she pulled at the reins of the steed. Off into the forest she galloped. Antonio watched and listened as the stallion disappeared amidst the forest. He felt comfort knowing his daughter was safe and did not mind if death took him. For 3 days he writhed, until after his 4th day felt something quite refreshing. The bubo in his groin shrank and the fever disappeared. The effects of the plague were still upon him. Though he was weak, he was not so weak that he could not forage or crawl to a nearby stream. He drank the water at the night and ate the worms in the morning. He regained a bit more strength and speared rabbits with sharpened sticks and cooked their bodies over an open fire. Antonio ate well, and for weeks he regained his strength until, at last, he was ready to make his journey to Ferrara. Antonio walked a path only he and his family knew, a path they typically rode several times a year. The bonds of family carried him through these dark times, and amidst the chaos, he pressed on. Isabella had found the farm in Ferrara, and she was welcomed. A few months had passed since her arrival, and the family mourned the loss of Antonio, for they assumed he died. Isabella sat alone and still one summer evening as the sun fell in the distance. The earth was flat before her, and a thick forest encircled the farm. From beneath the sun, she watched her father emerge from the trees. She did not know it was her father and took no care of who it was. As Antonio approached, Isabella thought the man's stride seemed familiar. She stood tall and studied him, and then she realized it was her father. She ran as fast as she could across open fields, and tears fell down her cheeks. Her legs did not falter, nor did she relent. As her black hair bounced in the wind, she opened her arms. Antonio embraced his daughter and stroked the back of her head. He held her then, and she began to cry. They both cried. Together they fell to the warm summer earth, and the sun finally set. In the open summer fields, they lay together and watched the stars streak across the sky. He recounted his tale of survival in the forest, and she relished every moment. Antonio and Isabella remained on the farm until the plague passed. The world never returned to its old ways. This provided opportunities for both Antonio and Isabella. Antonio became a businessman. He sold pelts in the city of Ferrara, and Isabella became a tailor. She wed an Englishman, and Antonio never remarried. The two of them lived side by side. He delighted in the splendor of many grandchildren before he grew old and joined his wife in heaven. With that, I draw an end to the narrated short story series, The Bubonic God. I hope I leave you with a sense of how strong the human spirit had to be to persevere against the sweeping curtain of the bubonic plague. I hope you enjoyed this piece of historical fiction, and I would appreciate any comments you have to be provided in the comment section below. My name is Michael Bear. I write and narrate my own stories, and I really enjoy doing this kind of thing. I like to write anything, really. Fantasy, horror, historical fiction, romance, fairy tales, science fiction, well, anything really. So if you would like to hear more of my work, click subscribe. I really enjoyed the story, and I hope you did as well. Until the next one, cheers.